There's a particular silence that settles over American highways after midnight, a hush broken only by the rhythm of tires slicing through rain and the soft purr of engines carrying the restless, the desperate, or those who simply cannot sleep. I never meant to be the sort of man who found comfort in these hours, but after 3 decades behind the wheel cab, coach, hearse, whatever the city had to offer, I found myself most at ease when the world was at its quietest and most uncertain. That night, the jog came through on my phone at 1:47 a.m., the screen buzzing with the kind of urgency you only get from someone who's already given up on finding a proper ride. "Long run," the dispatcher texted. 2 towns over, pick up by 4. No special requests, but pays good. "You in?" I was already halfway dressed, the coffee in my cup still steaming. The rain outside had begun around midnight, tapping an uneven beat against the kitchen window, fog collecting in halos around the street lamps. I checked the route on my phone, Highway 41, straight through a stretch of country that had always felt half forgotten, the kind of place where the radio lost signal and the only other cars were semis, barreling east with their cargo and their secrets. There was something about that night, the rain, maybe, or the way the air hummed with electricity, that put me on edge before I'd even left the driveway. My old Crown Vic was already waiting, parked beneath the sodium lamp that buzzed and sputtered with every gust of wind. I slid behind the wheel, the seat still holding the shape of my body from the night before, and flicked on the radio more out of habit than need. It was always the same. Late-night talk shows, static-ridden country songs, the occasional weather update warning travelers to keep their wits about them. I left the dial on the classic hit station, the soft crackle of old rock and roll settling into the background as I pulled out onto the slick, shining street. The city was a blur of lights and puddles, storefronts shuttered, crosswalks empty, every sign of life tucked away behind curtains and bolted doors. I picked up the passenger, a man in his late 40s, maybe older, rain-soaked and silent, at a gas station on the edge of town. He climbed in with a nod, didn't offer a name, just handed me a crumpled bill and said, "Just get me there before sunrise." His eyes met mine in the rearview mirror only once, and for a moment I thought I saw a flash of something regret, maybe, or fear, but he looked away before I could be sure. He smelled of cigarette smoke and old aftershave, the kind of scent that lingered in the fabric of my car long after he'd settled into the back seat. I punched the address into the GPS, watched the line trace its route through a dozen towns I'd passed 1,000 times, and started the engine with a sigh. The rain was relentless, drumming on the roof, streaming in sheets across the windshield, the wipers working overtime just to keep a narrow band of clarity in front of me. The headlights caught every drop, turning the road into a river of gold and silver, the lines blurring, the darkness on either side growing thicker with every mile. The radio played on, the DJ's voice fading in and out, never quite managing to drown out the sound of the storm. Every so often, I glanced in the rearview, half expecting my passenger to speak, but he only stared out the window, his face reflected in the glass, features lost in shadow. The miles rolled by, the world outside reduced to the twin cones of light from my high beams, the endless hiss of water beneath the tires. There's a loneliness to these drives, a sense of being caught between worlds, neither here nor there, with nothing but time and distance to keep you company. I'd learned long ago not to ask questions, not to probe the stories of the people who found themselves in my back seat at such an hour. Some were running from something, some towards, but most just wanted to be left alone with their thoughts and their ghosts. I hummed along with the radio, the song a familiar lullaby, and tried not to wonder what waited for us at the other end of the journey. As we left the last streetlight behind, and the road narrowed to a ribbon of asphalt, cutting through endless woods, the air inside the car grew colder, the windows fogging slightly despite the heat blowing on my feet. I turned the dial, nudged the volume up, but the signal wavered, static crackling through the speakers, the song dissolving into a wash of white noise. I thought about asking my passenger if he minded the sound, but when I glanced back, his eyes were closed, lips moving as if reciting a prayer or a confession to someone I couldn't see. I let him be, fingers drumming on the steering wheel, eyes flicking from the glowing dash to the shadows pressed close on either side of the car. We passed mile marker 68-1 of those battered green signs, half swallowed by vines, and the road dipped suddenly, the rain pooling in a shallow basin that rocked the car as we splashed through. For a moment, everything went silent, the radio dead, the engine's rumble fading, the world outside reduced to the frantic beating of my own heart. Then, just as suddenly, the sound returned, louder than before, the radio bursting into life with a burst of static and a voice I didn't recognize. I shot a look at the dial, saw the numbers flickering, the display caught between stations, unable to settle on any one frequency. The voice was soft at first, almost a whisper, but it grew clearer as we drove, repeating the same phrase again and again. "I'm sorry. Please, I'm sorry." The words crawled through the speakers, threading themselves around the melody of the rain, the hum of the tires, the pounding in my chest. I glanced at my passenger, expecting him to react, but he seemed oblivious, head bowed, hands clenched tight in his lap. The voice continued, unwavering, a litany of regret that seemed to fill the car, seeping into every crack and seam. I turned the volume down, then up, switched stations, but the voice remained, echoing on every frequency, as if the apology were not meant for anyone in particular, but for anyone who happened to be listening at that lonely hour, on that lonely stretch of road. The rain redoubled, wind lashing the trees outside, and for a moment, I felt as though we were moving not through the world, but through a memory, someone else's nightmare, someone else's confession, bleeding into the present with every mile. The sensation of being watched crept over me, slow and insistent, as if the car were no longer empty, but crowded with invisible witnesses, each bearing their own sorrow, their own plea for forgiveness. The passenger stirred, eyes opening, and met my gaze in the mirror. "Almost there?" he asked, his voice raw, but I shook my head, unable to form words around the fear tightening my throat. The voice on the radio grew louder, the words slurring into a single, endless apology, until at last the car crested a rise and the signal faded, the normal programming returning as if nothing had happened. But I knew, even then, that something had changed. The road ahead was the same, a winding strip of blacktop vanishing into darkness, rain falling in sheets, trees leaning close as if to listen, but the silence inside the car was deeper, heavier, haunted by the echo of a voice begging for forgiveness, a plea I could not ignore. And as I drove on, heart racing, hands slick on the wheel, I understood that the journey was only beginning, that whatever waited at the end of the road was not just a destination, but a reckoning one that would not be satisfied until the truth was known, and the dead, at last, were forgiven. The road narrowed further as I pressed on, the rain growing heavier, painting long reflective veins across the highway, each one flickering in the headlights before vanishing under my tires. The landscape outside was awash of shadow and intermittent color-broken billboards, the skeletal forms of trees stretching skyward, power lines sagging with the weight of water and time. I gripped the wheel tighter, feeling a restless energy prickle along the base of my neck, a kind of anticipation that never seemed to dissipate on nights like this. The passenger in the back remained silent, a brooding presence blurred by the shifting light, neither asleep nor fully awake. I kept the radio on low, the familiar voices of talk show hosts and late-night disc jockeys warbling through the static, just enough to keep the edge off the loneliness that comes from being the only conscious soul on a stretch of deserted highway. It was after 3 in the morning when the road began to climb gently into a region where the fog pooled thickest, shrouding the ditches and creeping up over the fields. At first, I thought it was just interference. The radio had always been fickle out here, the frequencies shifting as you rounded certain bends, the static sharpening or vanishing, as if the air itself decided what you were permitted to hear. I flicked the dial from station to station, searching for a patch of music or a voice to fill the silence. For a brief moment, I caught a fragment of some old blues song, a woman's voice lamenting lost love, but the sound was swept away by a sudden burst of static so harsh it made me wince. Then came the silence, a gap, abrupt and total, that settled over the interior of the car like a heavy, expectant hush. I tapped the radio, but the digital display blinked erratically, numbers jumbling before settling on a frequency I didn't recognize, a place on the dial I'd never seen in all my years driving these roads. At first, there was nothing but the wet hush of rain, a low hum beneath the static. Then, through the interference, I heard a voice thin, distant, as though broadcast from somewhere far away, or perhaps from a place just outside the range of understanding. It spoke only 2 words at first. "I'm sorry," drawn out, barely more than a breath, but insistent. The sound sent a chill crawling up my arms, my heart stuttering as I shot a glance at the rearview mirror. My passenger's head was down, face shrouded in darkness, unmoving. I fiddled with the controls, trying to clear the signal, but the voice only grew louder, threading itself between the static, weaving in and out of the noise with the persistence of a desperate confession. "Please forgive me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The phrases looped and blurred, words dissolving into one another, always returning to that singular, plaintive apology. The tone was strangled with regret, a raw ache that felt too personal, too real, to be the product of any late-night radio drama or prank call. I tried to switch the station, turning the dial all the way to the left, then the right, but every frequency returned the same broken transmission apology after apology, overlaid with a warbling note of anguish that rose and fell with the rhythm of the rain. A strange pressure built in my chest, a sense that I was intruding on something sacred, or perhaps being asked to bear witness to a grief that refused to fade. For a moment, I considered pulling over, stepping out into the wet grass just to clear my head. But the road was empty, and the idea of leaving the safety of the car, of inviting whatever force was haunting the airwaves to follow me into the darkness, was unbearable. I pressed on, knuckles white on the steering wheel, eyes scanning the gloom for any landmark, any sign of normalcy. A distant farmhouse light, the blinking red of a cell tower, the reassuring gleam of a passing truck's headlights. But the world outside had shrunk to a tunnel of black and silver, the night growing heavier with every mile. The apologies continued, winding tighter, as if the voice sensed my rising discomfort and sought to break through the barrier of disbelief. There was no hint of accent, no clear indicator of age or gender, just that mounting desperation, that hollow resonance of someone begging for release. I swallowed hard, glancing once more at my passenger, half expecting him to react, to look up and ask what I was hearing. But he sat rigid, almost statuesque, as if frozen in some private purgatory. The radio display flickered again, and for a heartbeat, a string of numbers flashed across the screen: 417, 66.7, and nothing but a blank space. I told myself it was an atmospheric anomaly, some ghost of a transmission bouncing off the low clouds, a fragment of another driver's conversation caught in the wrong channel. But the words kept coming, the same plea for forgiveness, the same note of panic and sorrow threading through each repetition. "Please, I'm sorry. Forgive me. Please, forgive me." The static sharpened, and then, for a few seconds, I thought I heard a second voice layered beneath the first, quieter, almost whispering. But before I could make sense of it, the signal dissolved, and the normal radio returned, a weather report, warning of flash flooding ahead, a jingle for some distant roadside diner, all mundane and hollow after the confession that had filled the car. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, hands aching from the tight grip on the wheel, sweat cooling on my brow despite the chill in the air. My passenger stirred at last, shifting in the seat, his outline reflected in the rearview, features still hidden by the shadows cast from the passing mile markers and the ceaseless rain. I wanted to ask he'd heard the broadcast, if the apology meant anything to him, but the words caught in my throat. Something about the intimacy of that repeated confession, so raw, so persistent, felt dangerous to name, as if speaking it aloud would give it a power over me that I wasn't ready to confront. The road unfurled ahead, black and endless, the world beyond the windshield shrinking to a single vanishing point, where memory and imagination could no longer be separated. The voice was gone for now, but its echo lingered, threaded through the steady pulse of the engine and the rain, a question without an answer, a wound without a name. I pressed on, knowing the night was far from over, that the journey, whatever it truly was, had only just begun. Somewhere beyond the last convenience store lights and the distant glimmer of town, the rain slackened, but the world felt heavier, as if the storm had left a residue on the road and in the air itself. The forest on either side of the highway became a black wall, the trees leaning close, their branches knitting together over the road to swallow what little moonlight managed to break through the clouds. My focus narrowed to the double yellow line flickering beneath my headlights, the familiar rhythm of wiper blades thudding against the glass, and the soft, ever-present crackle of the radio, which now seemed to hide meaning in every hiss and stutter. I was alert, every sense stretched tight, trying to pretend that the radio episode, the apology looping on every station, was a trick of weather, or a prank that would fade as suddenly as it arrived. But the voice had found its way into my head, nestling deep where sleep and memory blend, and I felt the apology vibrating in the bones of my hands as they gripped the wheel. It was not only the words I heard, but the sensation of being addressed, as if something or someone was trying to reach through the layers of static and distance to make itself understood. The passenger remained a shapeless presence in the back seat, his head bent forward, body unmoving except for the occasional shift in posture that I glimpsed in the mirror. The details of his face seemed harder to hold on to the longer the night dragged on, sometimes older, sometimes younger, features lost in the interplay of passing lights and pooling shadows. I told myself it was just fatigue, the same weariness that blurred exit signs and made mile markers flicker at the edge of my vision. Yet as the car climbed the next rise and dipped into another hollow, I became aware of a new sensation, a subtle, irrational certainty that there was someone else in the car, a presence that belonged neither to me nor to the man who had handed me cash at the start of the journey. It was not a sound or a shape that made me notice, but a shift in the air, a weight pressing gently against my right shoulder, a prickle along the back of my neck that had nothing to do with the cold. I tried to shake the feeling, but the apology on the radio seemed to pulse with it, as if the broadcast was less a technical anomaly than a symptom of something living, breathing, waiting in the confined space behind my seat. Each time we passed the low area where the voice had first broken through, the radio erupted with that same string of desperate pleas, louder and clearer, the apology gaining urgency, almost as if it could sense our presence and was determined to be heard. Please forgive me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The air inside the car thickened, the temperature dropping so fast that I had to turn up the heat just to keep my hands from going numb. My breath fogged the glass, and I wiped the windshield with my sleeve, watching the world outside fade into a smear of color and movement. In the mirror, my passenger seemed smaller, hunched over, hands clasped in his lap, as though he too could feel the presence that pressed in from every side. The car grew quieter with every mile, the rain softening to a whisper, the engine's hum swallowed by the weight of silence and the looping apology. I began to lose the thread of time, unable to say how long I'd been driving since the voice first broke through, the dashboard clock flickering, resetting itself to strange hours, sometimes earlier, sometimes impossibly late. I reached down to change the station, but my fingers hesitated over the buttons, reluctant to disturb the delicate balance of the moment. I realized with a shock that I was afraid, not just of the voice, but of what might happen if it went silent. The apology had become my anchor, the only evidence that something real was happening, that I was not lost in a dream or a memory too dense to escape. Every time the car passed the same curve in the road, just before the old iron bridge that spanned a nameless creek. The apology swelled in volume and intensity, filling the car, echoing from speaker to speaker, until it seemed to vibrate in the fillings of my teeth. On the third or fourth repetition, I caught a scent on the airy mix of cigarette smoke and something colder, metallic, like the aftertaste of fear. I shot a look in the rearview mirror, and for the briefest moment, the back seat seemed crowded, a blur of movement, a shape outlined against the darkness that could not be explained by the laws of light or logic. The sensation of another's presence was overwhelming. I could feel a weight on the cushion behind me, a faint creak of the seat springs, the brush of air, as if someone had leaned forward to whisper in my ear, "Please, I'm sorry." This time, the apology came not only from the radio, but seemed to vibrate through the very air, an echo caught between the living and the dead, searching desperately for acknowledgement. My hands tightened on the wheel. I risked a look back, my eyes flicking up to meet the passengers in the glass. His gaze met mine, and something shifted between us, an understanding as cold and ancient as the road itself. He did not speak, but the silence between us grew charged, filled with all the words that could not be spoken aloud. I blinked and looked away, returning my focus to the ribbon of highway ahead. The voice on the radio faltered, the static swelling for a moment, and resumed with renewed force. I realized then that the apology would not stop, that the cycle would repeat itself every time we crossed that hidden threshold in the night. By the fifth pass, my nerves frayed and my mind racing, I began to notice other details, the condensation thickening on the windows, the persistent chill that crept into the car despite the heater's efforts, the way the headlights flickered as we passed beneath the canopy of trees, branches bowing low as if in mourning. The road felt endless, a loop with no clear beginning or end, and I started to lose track of the towns we had passed, the turns we had made. The only constant was the apology, the invisible passenger whose presence grew stronger with every mile, whose regrets seemed to seep into my own bones, blurring the boundaries between myself, my fare, and the unknown presence that traveled with us. There is a point on every journey where reality gives way to something stranger, where what you think you know about yourself and your world is challenged by the persistence of the unknown. As the night deepened, as the apology filled the car and the invisible passenger pressed closer, I understood that I was no longer just a driver ferrying a fare to some distant town. I was a witness, perhaps a confessor, caught in the middle of a story that had been waiting for someone to listen, to remember, and maybe to forgive. The rain began to fall harder once more, drumming out a relentless rhythm as I pressed on, the car crowded with ghosts, the radio humming with apologies, the truth still waiting for its moment to be revealed. As the hours stretched and the lines on the highway blurred into ghostly ribbons of yellow and white, I found myself slipping into a waking trance. The steady movement of the car and the persistent echo of the apology weaving together into something that felt less like driving and more like drifting through a feverish memory. My hands remained firm on the wheel, but my mind began to wander in ways I couldn't control. It started as a vague unease, a flicker at the edges of perception, a flash of taillights reflected in the drizzle, the echo of laughter from some distant summer, the sharp tong of burnt coffee at a nameless roadside diner. But as the apology looped on, threading its regret through every crack in the static, these flickers grew sharper, more insistent, until I could no longer tell where my thoughts ended and the night's borrowed memories began. The landscape beyond the windshield was formless, washed in fog and silver, the trees merging with the clouds, the darkness pooling in ditches and between fence posts. Yet I began to see things in the gloom, half-familiar sights that sent a shiver through me, though I could not name why. There was an old rusted mailbox, leaning crooked at the end of a gravel lane, a billboard for a defunct motel, its paint peeling, the slogan, "Clean rooms, clean sheets, clean conscience," barely legible. A tangle of wildflowers on the shoulder, crushed and slick with rain, their petals luminous in the headlights. I felt as if I had driven this road 100 times, though my logbook would say otherwise. And each passing landmark sparked a rush of feeling sadness, longing, and inexplicable guilt that settled on my shoulders like a damp cloak. As I listened to the voice on the radio, it seemed to change, growing more urgent, more personal. The words, "I'm sorry, forgive me," were now colored with details that tugged at something deep within me. "It wasn't meant to end like this," the voice whispered, slipping in between the static. "Please, I never wanted to hurt anyone." I flinched at the specificity, at the sense that the apology was not just for some faceless victim, but directed at me, or through me, to someone I might have been or become. Images surged up, a hand gripping the back of a car seat, a pale face caught in the flash of passing headlights, the bitter taste of fear and adrenaline, the slippery weight of secrets too heavy to share. These weren't my memories, I told myself, but the line between what I remembered and what I received grew thinner with every mile. The passenger in the back seat remained motionless, but now and then I caught a glimpse of his eyes in the mirror, sharp and searching, as if he too sensed the intrusion. The way the car had become a vessel for more than just flesh and metal. The air grew thick, each breath heavy with the scent of rain, old upholstery, and something subtler, an undercurrent of nostalgia, tinged with loss. I tried to hum along with the music that followed the apologies, but the melody faltered, caught in my throat by a grief I could not name. Each time the car rounded the same bend near the abandoned farmhouse, the memories grew more vivid. A woman standing in a doorway, backlit and silent. A pair of children running through the grass, their laughter echoing into the dark. The sudden, shattering noise of impact metal on metal, glass breaking, a scream cut short by the closing of a door. I began to wonder if I was dreaming, if the exhaustion and isolation of the night had pushed me beyond the boundary where reason ruled. But the sensations were too clear, the feelings too sharp, to be dismissed as fantasy. I found myself whispering apologies into the mist, my voice barely audible above the hiss of the tires, as if by echoing the words of the broadcast, I might absolve myself, or the invisible passenger, or the stranger whose memories now braided with my own. I thought of my own mistakes, the times I had chosen silence over truth, distance over comfort, all the apologies I had never offered, the forgiveness I had never sought. There were moments when the road itself seemed to dissolve, the lines and signs and markers slipping away, leaving only a sense of motion and the insistent need to reach some destination I could not name. At one point, as the radio fell silent for a heartbeat, I glimpsed in the fog the outline of a man standing by the side of the road, hand raised as if to flag me down. I slowed, heart thundering, but as I drew close the figure vanished, swallowed by the mist, leaving only a chill in the car and a dampness on my brow. I pressed on, shaken, the apology resuming its chant as I passed once again the curve near the iron bridge, the moment of return marked by a sudden, stifling cold. My passenger spoke at last, his voice thin and uncertain, as if he too was haunted by what we were experiencing. "Do you ever feel like you've forgotten something important?" he asked, not meeting my eyes. "Like there's something you should remember, but it's just out of reach?" I nodded, unsure if he meant the question for me or for the countless ghosts we carried with us. The apology on the radio grew faint, fading into a new kind of static, less like interference, more like the hush of breath drawn before a confession. The rain picked up again, and I drove on through the darkness, aware now that I was not just a witness to someone else's regret, but perhaps a participant in a story that was trying to tell itself through the fog, the night, and the voice of a stranger begging to be forgiven. As the miles unspooled, I lost myself in these memories, not all mine, not all foreign, caught in a tide of remorse that ebbed and flowed with every loop of the apology, every shadow at the roadside, every question left unasked. The journey had become an act of remembering, and as the night deepened and the fog pressed closer, I realized I would not reach my destination until I discovered what it was I was meant to recall, and whose forgiveness was truly being sought on that lonely, rain-slicked road. The fog thickened as the night pressed on, clinging to the surface of the road and swirling in ribbons around the fenders, so dense at times that the headlights only pushed it back a few feet. My sense of time began to fracture, minutes stretching and snapping back in loops, so that each new mile felt eerily familiar, as if I'd already driven it and was doomed to drive it again. The trees pressed close, dripping with rain, branches arching over the road like the ribs of a collapsed cathedral, and I began to recognize certain details I'd noticed before: the warped mailbox with its lid missing, the cracked green sign warning of a curve, the toppled construction cone resting in the ditch, half submerged in the mud. I realized then, with a creeping certainty, that I was moving through a cycle, circling some invisible point in the night where memory, regret, and the supernatural converged. The radio was a living thing now, shifting between frequencies with a will of its own. Even when I pressed the button to turn it off, the red glow of the display refused to die, the speakers humming with a background of static and a heartbeat rhythm that was not part of any normal broadcast. I tried scanning for music, for weather, for even the comfort of a garbled advertisement, but all I found was that plea, the sorrowful apology growing sharper, almost intimate as the hours passed. "Forgive me. Please forgive me. I'm so sorry. I never meant." The message would fade, dissolve into noise, and then return with even greater urgency each time we passed the iron bridge, as if the land itself demanded the confession be repeated until it was finally understood. The passenger in the back seat had become a shadow in my peripheral vision, no longer simply a man hitching a ride in the dead of night, but a silent accomplice to my unraveling. I saw him sometimes reflected in the windows, a faint outline, the suggestion of eyes peering forward, tracking the progress of our journey with a patience that bordered on the inhuman. His presence felt heavier each time the apology re-emerged on the radio, the air between us thickening with shared dread, an unspoken contract binding us to this endless loop. I wanted to ask him who he was, what he remembered of this road and its sorrows, but the words dried up in my throat, lost beneath the churn of guilt and fear. Once, on a sudden impulse, I pulled the car over at a gravel turnout, the tires crunching against stone and wet leaves. The fog swallowed the taillights, muffling the world outside until it was just the sound of the engine ticking and the slow patter of rain. I switched off the ignition, let the silence build, daring the voice to follow me beyond the boundaries of movement. For a few seconds, all was still. Then the radio flared back to life, its speakers crackling, the apology cutting through with almost physical force. "Please just listen. Please." My hands shook as I yanked the keys from the ignition, but the voice continued, untethered to power or mechanics, as if it were broadcasting from the interior of my own skull. I stumbled out into the mist, the cold hitting my lungs in a rush, and leaned against the hood, chest heaving. In that moment, the apology sounded different, closer, less distorted, as if the boundaries of car and night and self had collapsed into one shared plea. I stood in the rain for what felt like a small eternity, eyes fixed on the swirling fog, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees, a lost soul seeking a ride, or perhaps the true source of the sorrow that haunted this stretch of highway. But no figure materialized. Only the apology remained, echoing softly even when I slammed the car door and forced the radio dial to 0. When I finally gave up and started driving again, the signal faded, the static resuming its reign, but the message returned like clockwork each time the car approached the old bridge. I tested the limits, driving faster, then slower, retracing the route, doubling back, but every crossing was marked by the same cycle. The voice, the regret, the plea for forgiveness. It was not a question of technology anymore, but of geography, of memory, of some unhealed wound in the land itself. As the loop repeated, the other details of the road began to feel sinister, complicit in the haunting. Street signs warped and unreadable in the headlights. A deer standing motionless on the shoulder with eyes like coins, watching with a terrible stillness, mailboxes listing toward the ground like mourners. At one point, I caught a glimpse of shattered glass glittering in the ditch, and the apology peaked in volume, filling the car with the raw ache of loss. It felt as though the voice was tied to a moment, a trauma frozen in time, desperate for release, but unable to find it as long as the right listener remained blind to the truth. The repetition became maddening. Each return to the bridge, a demand that I understand what was required of me, a punishment for the ignorance or indifference that had allowed the story to fester. The passenger, when he spoke at last, startled me out of my spiraling thoughts. "Do you hear it too?" His voice was low, hesitant, as though unsure whether he wanted an answer. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He leaned forward, face still shrouded in shadow. "It always happens here, doesn't it? Like the road is trying to say something." He sank back, the seat creaking, and the silence that followed was heavy with mutual realization. Whatever haunted this stretch of highway, it had chosen us. Or perhaps we had chosen it by taking this journey at this hour, with our hearts open just wide enough to let the sorrow in. The fog began to thin as dawn approached, the first suggestion of pale light drawing long shapes from the trees. But the apology did not cease. If anything, it grew more plaintive, more human, the voice trembling with the weight of a story that wanted to be heard and healed. Each repetition brought new shades of meaning, fragments of another life, bleeding into my own thoughts. The sense of running from something, of a split-second choice that could never be undone, of a name half remembered, and a promise broken under the weight of night and rain. I drove on, unable to leave the loop, the radio a metronome for regret, the invisible passenger in the back seat, now as much a part of me as my own shame and longing. The world outside the car was emptier than ever, the horizon a rumor of light that never seemed to draw nearer. But within the boundaries of that old sedan, haunted by radio waves and sorrow, I knew I was closer than ever to understanding not just what had happened on this road, but what I needed to do to set it right. Each time the signal returned, I was reminded the journey was not simply a matter of miles, but of memory, of reckoning, of forgiveness still out of reach, but calling me home, one apology at a time. The persistent cycle of apologies and the inexorable looping of that mist-shrouded stretch began to drive me inward, searching for sense, for meaning, for a reason behind the voice that haunted the radio and the sorrow that soaked through every seam of the night. The hours behind the wheel blurred. Fatigue and curiosity formed a toxic stew in my veins, each repetition of the apology tightening the screws of a guilt I could not name. At first I wondered if the passenger's silence, the way he faded into the background like an afterimage burned on film, meant he was complicit in some way, or perhaps that I was. But my mind kept reaching back, searching not only my own memory, but the collective memory of the land, the road, the way old American highways accumulate stories like tar and dust, secrets crushed into the cracks by generations of passing wheels. At a lonely gas station, where even the fluorescent lights flickered as if haunted, I pulled off, hands trembling, and let the car idle beside the single ancient pump. The clerk behind the fogged-up glass didn't look up as I entered, focused on his phone, the hum of a portable radio behind the counter playing, mercifully, nothing but instrumental music. I bought a cup of coffee and stood by the window, staring out at the empty highway, the rain now just a whisper on the pavement. The loop of the apology seemed to echo in my bones, its cadence matching my own heartbeat, and for the first time, the need to know overwhelmed the desire to run. I took out my phone and typed the name of the bridge, the county, accident, crime, forgive, apology. At first nothing surfaced, just weather warnings, a news blurb about a deer call, a handful of listings for a local church's rummage sale. I grew frustrated, cursing softly, but as I scrolled further back through the archives, switching to old, half-forgotten forums and microfiche scans of the regional paper, something strange began to emerge. There, almost erased by time and indifference, was a headline from 20 years ago. Hit and run kills young woman driver still at large. The details were sketchy. A rainy night, a battered sedan found abandoned on a muddy bank, shards of glass, and a single high heel left behind. The victim's name was listed only as Annabelle C., age 24. The reporter had written of mystery, regret, and no witnesses willing to come forward. But the quote from an anonymous local, buried halfway through the story, chilled me. Sometimes at night, you can still hear someone crying for forgiveness out on that stretch of road. My old man said the guilty always come back to the scene. I sat back, phone trembling in my hands, and read the article again and again, the words taking on new weight each time. Other snippets appeared, references in a message board about ghost stories. A tourist's blog entry, marveling at how her radio acted possessed near the bridge. A forum post from a long-haul trucker who swore he'd seen a woman in white walking the shoulder, mouthing something over and over, never crossing, never leaving. Each thread was thin, but together they formed a pattern, a tapestry of sorrow and guilt, left unresolved and echoing through the decades. The apology was not just a trick of the airwaves, not merely a glitch in some distant transmitter, but a wound in the land, kept open by repetition, by the unending need for absolution. I tried to dig deeper, but the trail ran cold, files disappeared, links led to dead ends, images failed to load. It was as if the story itself resisted being known, as if the memory of what happened was being eroded by time, or by something more deliberate. I jotted down the few facts I had. Annabelle Key, rainy night, driver missing, the apology that wouldn't let go, and looked over at my passenger, who sat as still as ever, his face unreadable in the half-light. "Does the name Annabelle mean anything to you?" I asked, my voice rough, unsure if I wanted an answer. He didn't reply, but I thought I saw him flinch, just a subtle shift in posture, his hands twisting together as if in pain. The air in the car felt charged, the apology on the radio falling silent for the briefest instant, as if pausing to listen. Back on the highway, the sense of history pressed in on me from every angle. The old barn half collapsed in the field, the rusted signposts with their unreadable names, the asphalt scarred by decades of weather and memory. I realized I was driving not only through space, but through the aftermath of a moment that had refused to die. Every time I passed the bridge, the apology would swell, sharpen, the signal growing clearer, the voice almost choking on its own regret. I could see the accident in my mind's eye, a swerve, a flash of red taillights, a shriek of brakes, the sudden hush after impact, the sound of footsteps running, and the echo of a promise broken on the wet pavement. The lines between then and now, between guilt and innocence, between the living and the dead, blurred. I felt the weight of all those years, the unanswered questions, the stories never told, the pain left hanging in the air like unfinished music. It was not just Annabelle's story, or the drivers, or the locals who whispered of ghosts. It was every unsolved crime, every wound that refuses to close until someone cares enough to remember, to look closer, to listen. The apology was not only a plea for forgiveness, but a demand for witness, for someone to acknowledge the wrong that had been done, to say, "I see you, I hear you, and your suffering matters." As the night wore on and the world grew quieter, the signal remained insistent, inescapable, the same sorrowful words echoing through static and rain. I pressed onward, heart pounding, feeling more than ever that this journey was no longer about delivering a passenger to his destination, but about reckoning with the past, about daring to forgive what could not be undone, and about finally letting the memory of a crime too long forgotten emerge into the uncertain light of a new day. It was well past 4 when the storm broke for a few minutes, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than the downpour itself, as if the very air held its breath with me. I was back on the road, the last coffee gone cold in the cup holder, knuckles white on the wheel. The world beyond the windshield was transformed. The fog seemed to move of its own accord, no longer content to cling to ditches and fence posts, but instead reaching long fingers across the road, swirling up over the hood and around the side mirrors, wrapping the car in a pale shroud. I turned the heat up, but for the first time all night, the air blowing from the vents felt utterly ineffective. A mere suggestion of warmth in a cabin growing steadily, impossibly colder. It wasn't the gradual chill of a failing heater, but a drop swift and decisive, as though the temperature itself had been wrenched downward by a will not my own. I glanced at the passenger in the rearview mirror, searching for some sign that he, too, felt the strange drop, but he sat rigid, face hidden in shadow, his breath steaming in the dim interior. The radio, which had faded into a background hum while I scoured for details about Annabelle C., now returned with new vigor, static sharp as splinters. The apology threaded through the white noise with a desperation that felt physical. "Please forgive me. Please, please, I'm sorry." It sounded closer now, as if the speaker were just beside me, lips pressed to my ear, breath cold and uneven. My skin prickled, hairs standing at attention, and every instinct urged me to stop the car, to fling open the door and bolt into the empty fields, just to escape that suffocating sense of presence. The windshield fogged from the inside, thin streaks running where my own breath struck the glass. The side windows clouded as well, and each attempt to clear them swiping with my sleeve. Adjusting the fan only seemed to make the mist thicker, more insistent. The rear view offered nothing but a haze punctuated by the glimmer of distant taillights. Red eyes floating in a world gone white. The lights blurred, doubled, then vanished, leaving only the reflected glow of the dashboard and my own features, gaunt and drawn, staring back at me in disbelief. A weight settled on my chest, an animal heaviness, as if the car was filling with water, and I was breathing liquid regret. The apology on the radio grew ragged, as though the voice were struggling not just to be heard, but to survive. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I'm so sorry. You have to believe me." The words seemed to echo, bouncing around the interior, a plea that found no purchase. I felt the urge to speak, to answer, to offer comfort or absolution, but my throat was tight. The words shriveled on my tongue. Then, just beyond the boundaries of logic, I heard something else, a subtle shift in the air behind me, the unmistakable creak of the back seat, as if someone had changed position, the soft exhale of another breath layered over my own. I froze, hands tightening further on the wheel. I dared a glance at the mirror, heart thundering. The passenger's silhouette had shifted, no longer pressed against the door, but leaning slightly forward, hands clasped on the back of my seat, posture stiff with dread or anticipation. The impression was unmistakable, yet utterly wrong. I had picked up only one fare, yet in that moment, with the chill biting through my jacket and the mist swirling like a living thing, I could not escape the certainty that there was now a third presence in the car, neither fully visible nor entirely gone. I tried to focus on the pressure of my foot on the gas, the sway of the car as the wind picked up, the shape of my own breath as it curled and faded in the dim. But the car had become a vessel for something older and colder than the storm. My mind returned to the stories I'd read in the gas station, the woman in white glimpsed by truckers, the cries for forgiveness heard in the dead of night, the way the bridge seemed to snare memory and bend time. The apology returned, looping more insistently, a voice almost weeping with longing. "Please, please, forgive me. I never meant." I closed my eyes for a second too long, the image of Annabelle C. floating behind my eyelids, hair plastered to her forehead, lips moving with words lost to the wind. I blinked hard, fighting to ground myself in the present, to ignore the freezing pressure pressing against my skin. A new layer of sound slipped into the mix of faint tapping, like fingernails on glass, irregular, echoing in the small space. I snapped my gaze to the side window, expecting rain, but the outside was bone dry. The tapping continued, moving to the back window, the rhythm matching the cadence of the apology. The urge to look back was overwhelming, but terror kept me facing forward, breath coming in short, visible bursts. I knew in my core that to look directly might unravel whatever thread was holding the boundary between the living and the dead, between sanity and the truth, waiting just out of sight. A sudden lurch of the car, as if something heavy had shifted in the trunk, jolted me. The apology cut out, replaced by a silence so complete it roared in my ears. Then, from the passenger seat beside me, a whisper. "It's always cold here. It never leaves." I whipped my head around, finding only empty space, the seatbelt slack, the cushion unmarked. When I looked to the mirror, my fare's eyes met mine, wide and pleading, as if begging for understanding. For forgiveness he could not articulate. The cold was now absolute, a deep ache in my bones, my teeth chattering in a way that had nothing to do with failing machinery. My hands were nearly numb, fingers locked around the wheel, white as bone. At last, the voice on the radio returned, softer now, as if exhausted. "Please, if you can hear me, just forgive. That's all I ever wanted." In that moment, something shifted in the air, as if the apology had briefly found an ear, a glimmer of hope, a crack in the cycle. The cold lingered, but it seemed to recede a fraction, enough for me to catch my breath, to press onward. Windshield smeared with condensation, the world outside, nothing but light and shadow and regret. A stretch of highway after the bridge became a corridor of silence, a tunnel between moments, time suspended until the apology returned again, looping through the static, searching for its answer. The air in the car never fully warmed after that, as if the haunting had claimed its place beside me, a companion as real as the passenger in the back seat. Every few minutes, a chill would pass through the cabin, and I would remember the plea, not just words, but the ache of a life interrupted, a forgiveness withheld, a wound that had frozen the very air in this lonely passageway. As dawn remained just a rumor on the horizon, I understood that until forgiveness was granted or the truth was finally spoken, the cold would remain a presence beside me, a sorrow coiled in every breath, an apology echoing between the living and the dead, seeking a moment of warmth that had been denied for far too long. The cold lingered in the car like a living thing, and each mile I put behind me seemed only to tighten its grip, frosting the windows from within and turning the world outside into a featureless smear of gray. I drove on in a daze, the apology now woven so deeply into the static of the radio that even the silence between its repetitions vibrated with anticipation. The fog closed around us, impenetrable, swallowing every trace of what had come before. It was as if the road itself had become unmoored from time and place, circling back again and again to the point where regret was born, but never allowed to die. The more the apology repeated, sometimes whispered, sometimes howled, always urgent, the more I felt the pressure to answer, to make sense of it, to find the person at its center. In the eerie isolation of that haunted corridor of asphalt, I realized that what the dead sought was not just to be heard, but to be known by name. I pulled into the next gas station, a pale island of buzzing fluorescence amid a sea of blackness, and stumbled from the car into the raw, damp air, hands aching with cold. I needed warmth, I needed light, but more than anything, I needed facts. The memory of the article about Annabelle C. still burned in my mind, but it was not enough. A name half hidden, a story with more questions than answers. Inside, the convenience store felt suspended in its own bubble of time. Aisles crowded with snack cakes and motor oil, the bored clerk barely glancing up from his phone. I fumbled with the touch-screen coffee machine, hands shaking, and asked him if he remembered an accident out on the bridge. Years ago, a young woman, a hit and run, maybe a name like Annabelle. His expression barely shifted, but something in his posture betrayed a flicker of recognition. "People talk about that place sometimes," he muttered, eyes darting away. "They say it's bad luck to stop there at night. Never heard a name, though. Cops don't like talking about it." I pressed on, asking if he'd ever heard the apology on the radio, in the air, from anyone passing through. "Sometimes," he said, more quietly now, "static in voices. People leave quick when that starts. Not everyone comes back." I sat at a Formica table in the corner and tried searching online again, cycling through every variation of the story missing woman, Cold Case, Haunted Bridge. Most of the links led nowhere. Pages deleted or archived so deep they may as well not exist. Even the local newspaper's records ended abruptly, as if the years themselves had been clipped out and tossed away. I found a thread on a message board, old as the internet itself, where someone who called themselves Fairy Ghost described a woman standing in the fog, always near the bridge, always mouthing words no one could quite make out. Another post, dated almost a decade earlier, referenced the girl with no marker and claimed her real name had been erased from police logs, her case bundled with dozens of lost ones after a flood destroyed part of the county records. One cryptic reply said, "Names are how we're remembered. If no one remembers your name, you'll never get to leave." That struck me harder than I expected. I thought of all the apologies left unsaid in my own life, all the people I'd lost track of, all the moments I'd meant to call, to write, to make things right, but never had. The feeling that the apology on the radio was becoming personal intensified with every breath. I scrolled further, chasing shadows. A genealogy site listing dozens of Annabelles in the area, only a few matching the timeline. A memorial fundraiser that had raised a paltry $100. No photo, no last name, no closure. A police scanner forum with a single post about a female mid-20s fatality, ID unknown. Each trail ended in the same way fragments, rumors, echoes, but never a whole story. Never a name I could hold on to and offer back to the voice begging in the static. I was about to give up, driven to a hollow frustration by the stubborn emptiness of every lead, when the door chime rang and an old woman entered, shaking rain from her coat, her eyes sharp despite the hour. She looked at me for a long moment, then glanced out at my car, still idling in the lot, its headlights casting long spears of light into the mist. "You're on the bridge tonight, aren't you?" she said softly, almost kindly. I nodded, surprised at the certainty in her voice. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "My sister used to say you could hear her if you listened close, the girl who got lost out there. Some people called her Anna, but her real name was Mary Annabel Crane. My mother knew her mother, but the records got messed up after the flood. Nobody wanted to remember what happened. Too much guilt in this town, too many secrets." Her words settled in me like a weight, an anchor thrown into a sea of fog and regret. Mary Annabel Crane, a full name, at last a person, not just a ghost or a rumor. I repeated it aloud, testing the syllables on my tongue, feeling the air in the store grow heavier as if the name itself had power. The woman nodded, her eyes sad but certain. "You say her name if you want to help her," she said. "She's been waiting a long time for someone to remember. Maybe that's all she ever needed." I thanked her, left a bill on the counter, and hurried back out into the night, my heart pounding, breath fogging in the cold. When I slid behind the wheel, the passenger in the back seat was waiting, silent as ever, but now somehow less opaque, as if naming the ghost had drawn her closer to the world of the living. I started the engine, the radio bursting instantly to life, the apology now clearer, more plaintive, and unless I imagined, it tinged with hope. "Forgive me. Please forgive me, Mary Annabel. I'm sorry. I never meant to." The name echoed through the static, and I felt a tremor in the air, a current of longing and grief, and something close to relief. I drove back toward the bridge, the name repeating in my mind with every turn of the tires, the apology now threading itself through my own memories, connecting every moment of regret, every instance of loss. I wondered if it would be enough, if simply naming the dead could break the loop, let her rest, or if the search for forgiveness was more complicated than that. But I knew I had to try. The car rolled on, the fog thick as ever, the cold still biting, but in the darkness, I felt the faintest suggestion of warmth, as if hope had entered the car for the first time all night. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a moment thought I saw a face in the back seat, a young woman's face, pale and shining, lips moving silently as she mouthed her own name. My breath caught, and I drove on, feeling the past and present swirl together, the boundary between the living and the dead growing thinner with every mile. The apology continued, but now there was a purpose behind it, a direction to the plea. Mary Annabel Crane. A name, at last a truth rescued from the fog, ready to be spoken on the haunted bridge before the sun could rise. There is a gravity to certain places, an invisible force that draws you back, no matter how much you wish to avoid them, no matter how far you think you've managed to escape. I felt it in every joint and muscle as I left the gas station's wan light behind, the memory of the old woman's voice echoing in my mind. Mary Annabel Crane, the syllables blooming with a kind of fragile hope. The name carried with it the weight of 1,000 apologies. Not only the sorrowful refrain from the radio, but my own catalogue of regrets, old wrongs left unspoken in the quiet hours of other endless nights. The apology loop had become personal, its urgency braided into my own heartbeat, so that I was no longer merely a witness to a haunting, but an accomplice willing or not. I was now a participant in the ritual the road demanded. The mist grew even thicker as I turned the car back toward the bridge, headlights reduced to twin dim orbs in the vast grayness, the dashboard casting faint shadows on my face. My passenger seemed more real now, the shadow in the back seat less a ghost and more an uneasy companion, a presence whose pain I could feel in the ache behind my eyes and the tightening in my chest. I spoke the name aloud, testing it against the silence. Mary Annabel Crane. The apology in the radio static flared, the voice trembling with renewed intensity, as if drawn up from the depths by the sudden recognition. Forgive me, Mary Annabel. I'm so sorry. Please, please let me go. The words fractured, breaking apart into static, and then reforming with each rotation of the wheels. Time slipped and twisted as I retraced my route. The familiar signs emerged from the fog in their precise order. The warped mailbox, the broken billboard with its promise of clean sheets and clean conscience, the field where wildflowers bowed beneath the weight of the dew. Each marker had become a gate, a checkpoint in a journey that felt less like travel and more like penance. I glanced at the clock, only to find that its digits blinked between impossible hours 3:32, 5:01, 12:24, time itself refusing to behave, as if the loop had unraveled and rewound so many times that the world's logic had grown weary of enforcing order. I slowed as the bridge approached, the road slick beneath the tires, the railings glistening with rain. The radio began to hiss and crackle, building toward the crescendo I had come to dread and depend upon. Please, Mary Annabel, I never meant. The voice sounded closer than ever, no longer only in the speakers, but inside the cabin itself, the very air shivering with desperation. My breath caught as I passed the midpoint of the bridge, every instinct screaming at me to stop, to get out, to bear witness at last to the tragedy that had given birth to this haunting. I pulled to the shoulder, hazard lights ticking a nervous rhythm, and sat with my hands shaking on the wheel. The apology looped in the stillness, the voice cracking with emotion. Please, Mary Annabel, forgive me. The mist pressed close to the windows, forming shapes that twisted and faded as I tried to focus. I forced myself to open the door, the cold rushing in with a force that made me gasp. For a moment, I simply stood in the downpour, heart hammering, staring down at the pavement slick with rain and memory. The air was so thick with longing and loss that it felt as though the world itself had narrowed to this single stretch of road, this single moment in time. The passenger door creaked as it opened, though I had not touched it. I turned and saw, for just an instant, a figure step out, a young woman in a white dress, her face hidden by the fall of her hair. Her lips moved, but the only sound was the apology on the radio, now blaring from the speakers in a language of heartbreak. She began to cross the road, each step leaving no mark, but sending ripples through the fog. I followed, the name rising to my lips like a prayer, and as I whispered Mary Annabel Crane, she paused, head lifting, the veil of hair parting to reveal eyes bright with sorrow and hope. The world seemed to hold its breath as she stood at the edge of the bridge, staring out into the darkness beyond the rails. The apology on the radio grew soft, almost reverent, the static dissolving into the low hum of the river below. I felt my own regrets rise up in me, sharp and unyielding, as though I too needed to confess, to be forgiven for things I had done and things I had failed to do. The boundaries between her story and mine dissolved. For a moment, we were bound by the same ache, the same longing for absolution. The passenger stood at my side now, not the man who had ridden in the back seat for miles, but a shifting presence sometimes familiar, sometimes a stranger, always reflecting my own face in the chrome of the side mirror, my own grief in the tremor of the apology. "This is the place," he said at last, his voice almost indistinguishable from the voice on the radio. "This is where it happened. This is where it always happens." I stood on the bridge with the ghosts of the past and my own restless heart, the night pressing in close, the apology looping quietly now, waiting for something more. I understood at last that I had not only returned to the scene of a crime, but to the point where memory and mercy intersected, a place where the living and the dead meet to reckon with the past. I spoke the name one more time, as gently as I could, and felt the world tremble, not with fear, but with the possibility that finally the story could change. In that suspended moment, I saw the shadow of the car that had left the scene long ago, the tire marks vanishing into the mist. The scream cut short, the silence that followed, and then the wind shifted, carrying with it the sound of a breath drawn and released, the faintest suggestion of relief. The apology faded for the first time since the journey began, replaced by a silence so deep and clean that it felt like the world had been washed, as if dawn itself waited just out of reach, holding its promise until forgiveness could be found, until a name spoken in the dark became the first word of a new morning. There is a particular resonance to silence after a storm, an electric hush that seems to vibrate with all the words that were never spoken, every feeling denied. As I stood beside the car on the edge of the bridge, rain dripping from my hair and soaking through my clothes, I realized that the night was no longer content to merely replay apologies and regret. Something fundamental in the air had shifted. The radio, which for hours had been locked in its loop of sorrow, now fell utterly silent, the static replaced by a ringing clarity, so sharp it seemed to carve a hollow in the space between breaths. The world around me waited, poised, as if some larger presence had arrived to bear witness to what came next. I leaned against the hood, the metal slipped beneath my hands, and listened. At first, there was only the sound of the river below, swollen by hours of rain, its current thick and hungry, swallowing every scrap of light. Then, from the open window of my car, a new voice emerged from the speakers. Not the pleading, exhausted apology I had come to dread, but something steadier, weightier, layered with an authority that brooked no evasion. "Tell us," the voice intoned, low and sonorous, reverberating as if spoken in a cathedral or a courtroom. "Tell us what happened here." I froze, heart thudding. The voice was neither male nor female, young nor old. It was the amalgam of every voice I'd ever heard in a place of reckoning. A teacher demanding honesty, a parent at the end of patience, a judge expecting truth. In its wake, other voices surfaced, each distinct and overlapping, forming a tapestry of memory and accusation. There was the frightened, pleading voice. "I'm sorry, I didn't see her. It was raining. She came out of nowhere. Please, please." Followed by the trembling anger of a mother. "You never stopped. You never tried to help. You just left her there in the dark." Then a voice trembling with despair, so soft it nearly broke apart. "Forgive me. Forgive me. I wanted to be brave. I wanted to do the right thing." These voices circled and entwined, rising and falling, as if replaying a trial that had no beginning and no verdict, only accusation and supplication, wound together in an endless loop. It was not just Annabelle's story being reenacted. It was every moment of guilt that anyone had ever carried along this haunted road. The friend who lied when it mattered, the neighbor who turned away, the driver who pressed the gas instead of the brake. The bridge had become a stage for judgment, the car a confessional, the night a jury that would not be dismissed until the truth had been spoken and heard. Inside the car, the temperature dropped again. I saw my breath hang in the air as the voices on the radio swelled, now intercut with the static of rain and the dull roar of the river. "Why didn't you stop?" demanded one. "Why did you run?" sobbed another. "Did you think she wouldn't be missed?" The questions landed like blows, each one echoing through the fog, the bridge, the trembling metal beneath my palms. I saw in my mind's eye the sequence of events as the judgment unfolded, not as it had happened, perhaps, but as it had been remembered, over and over, by everyone who ever crossed this span in the dark. I tried to answer, but my voice caught in my throat. The words would not come. The pain was not just Annibal's, but my own regrets I had buried, failures I had disguised as minor, the lives I had brushed aside in the rush to somewhere else. For a moment, I stood not as a driver on a night shift, not as a witness to someone else's tragedy, but as the one on trial, the sum of every story I tried to forget. I wanted to confess, to beg for forgiveness, but all I could do was listen, the voices swirling faster, the judgment intensifying, as if daring me to look away, to abandon this place, as so many had before. From the passenger seat came a low, anguished groan. I turned and saw a shifting shape, now the man who had ridden in silence for so many miles, now the pale outline of a young woman with her hair tangled in rain, now a flicker of my own face, lips moving in silent appeal. The figure reached out, fingers brushing the dashboard, and the radio sputtered with static before resolving into a final question, spoken in that same steady, inescapable tone. "Do you remember now? Will you answer? Who will carry the blame? And who will be forgiven?" The rain began again, soft but insistent, as if it too waited for my reply. I sank into the driver's seat, shivering, and stared at the empty road stretching away in both directions. The bridge no longer seemed a place of passage, but of reckoning, a threshold that demanded honesty, that would not release me until the balance had been restored. I reached for the radio, my fingers numb, and whispered the name, Mary Annabel Crane. "I remember you. I hear you." The apology echoed one last time, not from the speakers, but from the world itself, as if every drop of water, every gust of wind, every shadow in the mist had taken up the plea. There was no flash of light, no thunderclap of release, only the slow, heavy hush of judgment, the knowledge that the world had listened and was now waiting for forgiveness, for truth, for the impossible act of setting things right. In that moment, I understood that the journey had never really been about reaching a destination, but about circling back to the point where stories begin and end, the place where the living are judged not for the crimes of others, but for their willingness to witness, to remember, and when the time comes to forgive. The road ahead remained uncertain, but in the stillness that followed, I felt the first glimmer of hope that the cycle could, at last, be broken. In the silence that followed the judgment, I sat behind the wheel, hands numb, staring into the glistening dark that swallowed the bridge and the river below. The voices had ebbed for now, but their residue lingered, clinging to the car's interior and to my mind, where the echoes of accusation and regret, twisted and tangled with memories I could no longer trust as my own. I wiped a trembling hand across my face and watched as my breath coiled in the air, a thin thread of warmth in the cold, spectral hush. The radio, for the first time in hours, was truly silent. But the silence was not an end. It was a pause in the cycle, a vacuum drawing out memories, half-formed and glimmering, that belonged both to the ghostly confession and, disturbingly, to myself. For a long time I did not move. The world outside the car had become unreal, reduced to shadows and shivers of mist sliding across the blacktop. Time wavered, flickered, and buckled, so that it seemed all my nights on the road were stacked atop each other, the lonely highways of my youth, the bad routes after my divorce, the mindless shuttling of strangers back and forth beneath a world of dark, silent stars. It was as if the judgment had broken something loose inside me. My mind grew crowded with a gallery of faces, some familiar, some strange, A young woman waving from the shoulder, a pair of headlights cresting a distant hill, my own reflection in a rain-slicked window, wide-eyed and unsure. Each fragment shimmered with significance. Each demanded that I fit it into the puzzle. But the harder I tried to separate my own story from the one I had been drawn into, the more the pieces bled together. I began to remember things that had never happened to me, yet felt as if they had. The sensation of running through the rain, heart pounding, the slap of shoes on slick pavement, the crushing terror of headlights looming, the flash of white as a figure darted in front of a car, the metallic crunch, the taste of copper and adrenaline in my mouth. Then, the blinding, inescapable guilt that followed, the urge to flee, to erase the past by speed or silence or forgetting. But there were other memories too, one softer but no less sharp. The nervous laughter at the edge of a party, a voice whispering promises that would never be kept, a letter never sent, a bouquet of wildflowers left by the roadside. I wondered then if the road itself, the bridge and the mist, was a kind of vessel, pulling in every regret, every forgotten apology, every buried memory from the travelers who passed. Perhaps the judgment was never meant for only one person. Maybe every driver, every soul who crossed at the haunted hour left behind some piece of themselves, a truth too painful to carry into the daylight. It became impossible to say which apologies belonged to Annabel, to her killer, to her mother, to the men and women who looked away and moved on. The apology had become a chorus, each voice weaving in and out of the static, forming a single desperate song for forgiveness. In that blur of overlapping lives, I felt a swelling kinship, not only with the ghostly voice, but with the man who had sat in my backseat, silent and watchful, for mile after mile. His outline had faded, but I remembered his eyes, how they'd met mine in the rear view, shining with a fear I now recognized as my own. Had he been the driver all along, the one who struck Annabel down and then ran, spending years on the road in search of a forgiveness he could never claim? Or had he been just another wanderer, like me, ensnared by the story that haunted this stretch, his own sins drawn out and exposed by the unyielding demand for witness and repentance? I could no longer say. At times I felt his presence at my shoulder. At others, I thought I saw Annabel's pale face reflected in the glass, her lips forming the same word over and over, forgive, though I could not tell whether she was speaking to me or to herself. The past and the present braided together as the night deepened. Every time I closed my eyes, new scenes flickered. A childhood mistake, a friend left behind, a conversation I'd avoided that could have changed everything. The apology was mine now as much as anyone's. The plea for forgiveness turned inward. I understood, with a clarity that cut deeper than grief, that it is the nature of guilt to multiply, to seek new hosts, to travel like a rumor or a virus along the arteries of old roads. The bridge had become an altar, the car a moving chapel, the journey a ritual of endless return to the point of rupture. Yet in this tangled confusion, a strange peace began to creep in. The very act of facing these fragmented truths, of letting them wash over me, painful and disorienting though they were, felt like a kind of absolution. I could not untangle the past or determine which sins were mine to confess, but I could sit with the sorrow, acknowledge it, refuse to turn away. The radio crackled softly, as if gathering breath for another confession, and for the first time, I did not dread what might come next. I would carry these truths, even if I could never make them whole. I would bear witness to every life the road had touched, every apology that had gone unheard. And in that surrender, I felt something loosen, almost imperceptibly, a release not only for Annabel, or the ghostly passenger, or for the one who had run, but for myself. The bridge behind me glimmered in the mist, as if the river beneath it had finally carried some of the burden away. I started the engine, the headlights cutting two slender paths through the fog, and turned once more toward the road ahead, not to escape the truth, but to live with it, to let its fragments find their place in the story that would carry me to whatever reckoning or redemption waited at journey's end. When the radio came alive again, it was not with the same scattershot static, or the jumble of voices tangled in accusation and confession, but with a single clear tone, pure, high, unwavering, cutting through the fog of memory and the thickening air of the car like a silver needle through velvet. For a few breathless seconds, the road seemed to drop away, the world suspended in a hush so profound I could hear the thud of my own pulse and the distant roar of the swollen river. My hands, still locked around the wheel, trembled as I waited for what came next, the return of the apology that had hounded every mile, every memory, every splinter of the night. But when the voice finally broke the silence, it was different, no longer diffuse, no longer just the echo of some half-forgotten sin, but focused, intentional, as though it had found at last the frequency it needed, the precise channel through which it could reach me and only me. There was no static now, no sense that the message was looping endlessly for any wanderer who happened to pass by. Instead, it spoke directly, intimately, as if the boundaries between the living and the dead, the past and the present, had collapsed into a single line that stretched from the haunted bridge to the fragile heart beating in my chest. "Driver," the voice said, and I startled at the word. It was not a name, but it might as well have been, because I had become nothing but that, the carrier, the witness, the vessel for the apology. "I need you to listen." The voice was young, uncertain, but unmistakably personal, trembling with the exhaustion of endless pleading, but now sharpened with the hope that, perhaps, this time the message would find a home. "I know you can hear me. I know you've seen what I did. I didn't mean for any of it. Please, if you know her name, say it for me. Please, let her go. Please, forgive me." The words poured out, not rushed, but insistent, threading themselves into the space between my ribs, unraveling whatever small defenses I had built up through the night. The radio grew brighter, the tone almost melodic, as if it had tuned itself to the exact resonance of my own longing for release, from guilt, from sorrow, from the endless cycle of apology and judgment. I watched the mist swirl outside, saw the lights of the bridge flicker as if in reply, and realized that the plea was no longer just a message for the world, but a question posed directly to my own heart. I felt exposed, suddenly, all my secret failings and unfinished apologies called out into the open, given voice by the one who needed forgiveness as much as I did. The voice continued, weaving in details that struck me with their impossible intimacy. "You know what it's like, don't you? To regret the thing you cannot take back, to wish you could go back, change one small moment, to lie awake, night after night, replaying the scene and wishing for the courage to do the right thing. I have seen your memories. I know your road. You are not so different from me." My vision blurred as the words landed, heavy as stones. I was no longer certain where the line lay between myself and the lost, between my own remorse and the one whose sin had stained this stretch of highway. I saw again the faces in the fog, the woman at the gas station, the mother's voice in the radio's judgment, the flicker of a young woman's pale face reflected in the window, and behind them, my own shadow, ever the driver, ever the one who moved on while others remained trapped in the place where tragedy struck. The apology now shifted, less a plea for forgiveness from the dead, more a prayer that I would grant to the living and to myself. If you say her name, if you forgive, I will go. If you forgive yourself, maybe you will find peace too. The car felt smaller, the air denser, as if the world had been drawn into a point at the center of my chest. My breath caught, heart stuttering as I reached for words that had never come easily. For a moment, I hesitated, the weight of the night pressing me down. Every failure and cruelty and indifference I had ever visited upon another hovering around me in the mist. But the voice would not relent. "Mary Annabel Crane," it said, the syllables bright and piercing as the beam of my headlights through the fog. "Forgive me. Forgive her. Forgive yourself." The words became a refrain, not only from the speakers, but from the world itself, the river and the trees and the bridge, repeating them in the hush before dawn. I closed my eyes, let the plea echo through me, and found myself speaking first her name, Then my own apology, stumbling and halting but sincere. "I forgive you," I whispered, voice raw, the words swallowed by the dark. "I forgive her. I forgive myself." The feeling was not release, not right away, but a loosening, a warmth beginning to flicker where the cold had taken root. I looked to the mirror and saw, for just an instant, not the haunted face I'd worn all night, but something softer, the outline of the passenger in the back seat shimmering, lips curled in a tentative, grateful smile. The radio faded, the voice growing distant, the apology replaced at last by a silence that did not accuse, but comforted. The fog outside began to lift, the lights on the bridge burning steadier, the road ahead at last visible in the dimming darkness. I sat for a long while, the engine idling, the air in the car gently warming. The directed plea for forgiveness had been heard, not only by the dead, but by the living, by the man behind the wheel who could no longer claim innocence or ignorance, who was at last ready to carry the story forward into the new day, changed by the reckoning and by the grace he had both offered and received. The sky had begun its subtle shift toward dawn, though no real light yet touched the earth. The world remained veiled in indigo and fog, the shapes of trees and the skeletal railings of the bridge, barely more than hints of shadow at the edge of perception. I sat in the driver's seat, the car still idling, hands slack in my lap, breath coming slow and shallow as the last notes of the directed plea faded into a silence, so profound it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The radio was silent, the static gone, the apology replaced by something weightier, the sense of a door standing open somewhere between the past and the present. The chill lingered, but it was softer now, threaded with expectation rather than dread, a waiting quiet, as if the road and the river both anticipated what was to come. I stared into the mirror, searching the darkness for the face of the passenger, for the pale flicker of the woman whose name I had spoken, for any sign that this long and haunted journey had shifted the balance between suffering and release. For a moment, all was empty then, as if conjured from the very mist. The passenger took shape in the reflection. He looked at me, not as the silent cipher he had been all night, but with eyes luminous and sorrowful, brimming with the weight of truths held too long. "You know now, don't you?" he whispered, the words not spoken aloud, but vibrating in the marrow of my bones. "You see me. You see yourself." His voice was layered, harmonized with others, as if every soul who'd crossed this bridge, every lost and guilty traveler, spoke with him. A pressure built in my chest, old and familiar, the ache of grief and recognition. My mind ran back through all I'd learned, the news clippings, the forum posts, the whispered stories of Mary Annabel Crane, and the accident that had scarred the land. Yet it was not only her tragedy I carried now, but something deeper, a knot of regret tied to my own story, a thread that had woven itself unnoticed through the fabric of every mile I'd driven, every act of omission, every silence where truth should have lived. The fragments of memory that had plagued me throughout the night coalesced with a new and terrifying clarity. I saw myself much younger, wild with panic on a rain-soaked night, the flash of headlights, the swerve, the terrible impact, the scream that seemed to split the world in two, and then running, always running, letting the night and the storm swallow my sin and my shame. It was not a literal memory. I knew, logically, that I had never been on this bridge, never left a girl dying in the road. Yet the emotion was real, braided into every regret I'd ever harbored, every wound I'd failed to mend, every kindness withheld from someone in need. The man in the back seat, was he the guilty driver, the one who had vanished after Annabel's death, condemned to circle this stretch of road for eternity, until the right apology was spoken and the right witness heard? Or was he the reflection of every person who'd carried guilt for a life unredeemed? As I watched, his face shimmered, transforming a dozen different faces, ages, races, all bearing the same expression of fear and longing, then at last settling into the features I recognized as my own. It was like looking into a mirror from which I could not turn away. "It could have been any of us," the voice murmured, now a whisper from everywhere and nowhere. "It was all of us. The things we run from become the things that haunt us." A cold clarity swept over me. This road was not haunted by a single soul or a single crime, but by the cumulative weight of every forgotten name, every apology unspoken, every injustice shrugged away by those who found it easier to keep driving than to stop and bear witness. I saw again the woman in the gas station, the sadness in her eyes, the knowledge that her own family's story was knotted into the highway's legend. I heard the echoes of the radio's plea, not just for Annabelle, but for every victim, every perpetrator, every witness who'd ever passed through, too tired or too afraid to take responsibility for the harm that lingered in their wake. The road, the bridge, the fog, the ceaseless loop of sorrow, they were not just the setting, but the confession, the reckoning, the truth that refused to stay buried. My story, my passengers, Annabelle's, they were all the same, woven together in the tangled fabric of guilt and forgiveness that wrapped itself around this place, waiting for someone, anyone, to acknowledge it and break the cycle. I felt a trembling within, not quite fear and not quite hope, as if I were poised at the edge of a great decision. As if sensing my readiness, the passenger reached forward, his hand briefly resting on my shoulder, the touch colder than flesh, but more gentle than any comfort I'd known. "You see me," he whispered again, the sorrow lifting at last into something like gratitude. "You remember. That's all any of us ever needed." I closed my eyes, letting the tears slide down my cheeks, not caring who saw. I remembered every kindness I had failed to offer, every apology I had swallowed, every time I had looked away from suffering because it was easier than facing it. And when I opened my eyes, the seat behind me was empty, the mirror reflecting only the faint glow of dawn, beginning to edge the clouds with silver. The apology on the radio was gone, replaced by the low, steady hum of the engine and the river below. My own face, lined and tired but unburdened, stared back at me, changed in some fundamental way I could not yet name. I started the engine and pulled away from the bridge, the tires rolling easily over the wet pavement, the fog parting as I moved forward. I knew now who had needed forgiveness all along, and I knew, at last, that I was ready to grant it to the dead, to the living, and to myself. In the rear view, for just an instant, I thought I saw Mary Annabelle Crane walking along the edge of the bridge, hair shining with rain, her lips finally at peace. And then she, too, was gone, leaving only the promise of morning and the certainty that the journey and the story had been changed forever. The world outside the car had shifted by the time I left the bridge behind, but the dawn that crept over the horizon brought little warmth. It was the hush after a storm, the air thick with the cold clarity that comes not from peace, but from the raw edge of a wound newly exposed. The fog still pressed in from the low places, flowing in silver drifts across the highway and swallowing the fields. But now it seemed less menacing, more a shroud than a prison, waiting for the slow work of morning to lift it away. The radio remained silent, except for the soft purr of the engine and the whisper of the tires over wet pavement. I had thought that the journey would end with a single word of forgiveness, but as the miles fell away behind me, I realized that forgiveness, true forgiveness, the kind that changes anything, was never so simple. It was not enough to simply say, "I forgive you," and be released. The ache in my chest had deepened, as if the act of speaking the name and granting release had shifted the burden from the dead to the living. The story was not finished. The bridge, the river, the apology, they had all been waiting not just for my witness, but for my decision. And now, in the liminal space between night and day, I found myself wrestling with what it truly meant to let go, to forgive not just the sins of others, but my own failings, my own silent complicity in the pain of the world. I drove on, the highway stretching before me like an open wound, empty except for the occasional sweep of headlights in the opposite lane. Other travelers, other stories, other regrets. The memory of the voice on the radio, the shape of the passenger's sorrow, the echo of Annabelle's name, all of it had become a part of me, threaded through my thoughts, haunting my every heartbeat. I felt myself at a crossroads deeper than any marked by signposts or flashing lights. It was the ancient dilemma that lives at the heart of every haunting. Could I, should I, forgive what cannot be undone? Should I allow the weight of another's crime, or my own failures, to be washed away by a word, by the mere act of remembering and speaking and releasing? With every passing mile, the question grew heavier. The air in the car thickened again, the cold returning, the ghost of the apology flickering at the edge of hearing. I heard it not only from the radio, but from within the voice that said, "If you let go, are you erasing her pain? Are you excusing what can never be excused?" My hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles white, and I remembered every story I'd ever heard of survivors and witnesses, of victims' families left to hold the pieces while the rest of the world moved on. The bridge and the river, the lost name and the apology, they were not just relics of the past, but wounds that remained open, demanding justice, demanding recognition, demanding something more than a whispered, "I forgive you." It would have been easy to turn away, to speed up and leave the haunted stretch behind, to bury the night's memories under layers of routine and distraction. But the journey had stripped me of that luxury. The story demanded more. The story demanded a reckoning, a choice that would not allow me to pretend the suffering of the lost was separate from my own. The passenger's face, sometimes Annabelle's, sometimes the silent man's. Sometimes my own hovered in every reflection, every window, asking not only for forgiveness, but for the courage to acknowledge the cost. I slowed the car and pulled over beneath a stand of ancient maples, their bare limbs arching overhead, black against the bruising sky. I shut off the engine, sat in the hush, and let the tears come, the sorrow that was both mine and not mine washing through me in waves. I spoke Annabelle's name, spoke the apology, spoke my own regrets, and let the silence answer. In that hollow, I understood that forgiveness was never about erasing the past, or granting a pardon to those who had done irreparable harm. It was about bearing witness, about saying, "I see you. I see what happened. I will not forget." It was about choosing to continue, scarred but not broken, haunted but not paralyzed by guilt. In the quiet that followed, the impossible nature of forgiveness revealed itself. It is never clean, never total, never perfect. It does not restore the dead or erase the pain, but it allows the living to move forward, to carry the memory not as a curse, but as a lesson, a thread of empathy that connects us all. It is the act of granting mercy, not because the past deserves it, but because the future demands it, because to refuse is to remain forever trapped on the same haunted bridge, circling the same wound, never finding the road that leads away. I started the engine again, the car rolling forward as the first pale rays of sunlight pierced the fog. The radio, for the first time, played a song I could not name, its melody soft and bittersweet, carrying with it the promise of release. The story was not ended, nor the wound entirely healed, but as I drove on I felt the weight lessen, the cold ease, the presence in the back seat fade to a gentle memory. The impossible forgiveness had not erased the past, but it had given me, and perhaps the ones I had carried with me, permission to go on. With each mile, the world grew brighter, the day stretching out before me, uncertain, but no longer entirely shadowed by regret. I looked in the mirror and saw only myself, changed by the journey, still scarred but moving forward, learning slowly, painfully, that sometimes forgiveness is not a single act, but a road you must choose again and again, each time you come to the haunted places in your own life. It's a strange thing, the way the world transforms in the moments just before sunrise. The darkness is at its deepest, the fog at its thickest, every sound amplified and sharpened, as if the night itself resists letting go. I drove on through that liminal hour, the bridge now far behind, its weight slowly lifting from my shoulders as the car cut through the last shreds of mist. The road unfurled before me, slick and silver, the sky brightening by degrees, first a dull graphite, then pewter, then the faintest blush of blue stealing into the east. The radio, quiet after the storm of apologies and judgment, now offered only the gentle static of empty air, a peaceful silence that was neither erasure nor denial, but the earned quiet after reckoning. Inside the car, the chill that had haunted me for so many miles began to dissipate. The heater, unnoticed before, now radiated a gentle warmth, and the numbness in my hands and chest softened, replaced by a tentative hope that felt foreign after so many hours of tension. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shadowed face, the passenger's sorrowful eyes, the pale glimmer of Annabel's presence. But there was only the empty seat, the upholstery still damp from the night, bathed in the pale gold of the coming day. I reached for the radio dial, fingers tentative, as if unsure whether I would summon back the voice from the static, but all I found was the low hum of the engine and the soft beginnings of a song, a melody, without words, delicate and uplifting, the sort of music that accompanies a scene of departure rather than arrival. As the world brightened, so did the certainty that something real had happened in the night, something that would mark me forever, whether or not anyone else believed it, whether or not any trace of it remained on the outside. The apology and the plea for forgiveness, the trial on the bridge, the shivering realization that the sins of strangers can become the burdens of the living, all of it was stitched into the fabric of my memory now, a tapestry as much about my own failures and losses as about the tragedy I'd been called to witness. I felt the truth of it in my bones that forgiveness, whether offered or withheld, does not erase the past or heal the wounds left behind. Instead, it allows those who remain to keep walking, to bear the memory forward, to let the lost become a part of the story without being trapped within it. The sun finally crested the line of hills, light diffusing through the trees and poling in the furrows of the fields. The mist receded, curling back toward the river, exposing patches of glistening earth and the dark lines of fences marking property and boundary and belonging. I breathed in the new day, lungs filling with the sweet, damp air, and with every mile I felt myself growing lighter, the ache in my chest fading to a bearable, instructive sorrow. The road was mine again, not haunted, but remembered, changed by the night's passage, but no longer ruled by it. I watched the town emerge from the shadows, the first houses catching sunlight on their windows, street lamps blinking off one by one as the darkness retreated. I could almost believe that the journey had been nothing more than a dream, a fevered hallucination brought on by too much coffee and not enough sleep. But as I turned onto Main Street, passing the bakery with its windows fogged from the heat of the morning bread, I caught my own reflection in the glass. Older, yes, and more tired, but also steadier. A man who had carried something terrible, and, against all odds, managed to set it down. The radio offered one final gift of voice, not the apology of the dead, but the clear, bright voice of a child, singing a wordless tune in the background of a local broadcast, laughter bubbling at the edges. It was a sound I hadn't known I needed, a promise that life persisted, that even here, on a road shaped by regret and memory, joy could return. I turned the volume up, letting the music fill the car, and drove the last few blocks to my destination. As I parked, the dawn now blazing over the rooftops, I sat for a moment in the hush, hands loose on the wheel, and whispered, "Thank you for letting me remember, for letting me forgive, for letting me go." There was no answer, but the gentle hum of the town waking up, the clang of a trash can lid, the yawn of an opening door, the small miracles of daily life that had always been there, waiting for my attention. I gathered my things, stepped out into the morning, and felt the world settle around me, lighter and clearer than it had been in a long time. The bridge and its apology would remain, somewhere out in the mist, a memory that belonged as much to the road as to me. But I was no longer trapped there. I was free, at least for now, to live in the world I'd reclaimed, to carry the lesson of that impossible forgiveness forward, to forgive and to remember, not as a ghost, but as a man who had, at last, reached the other side.